Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video, and welcome to another instalment in my discussion videos on my ongoing Victorian style relong of Charles Dickens's Bleak House. If you aren't aware, I'm currently hosting a Victorian-style read-along of Charles Dickens's Bleak House, where I read the book in its original monthly parts. We are nearing the end, we are getting there, and today I'm going to be talking about the chapters that we read in May. I'm sorry this video is a bit late, it's been a very hectic month or two. So, in the month of May, we read the following chapters. Chapter 47, Jo's Will, Chapter 48, Closing In, and Chapter 49, Dutiful Friendship. So, many dramatic and exciting things to talk about here. As usual, I will talk through kind of what happens in each chapter, as well as some points of interest. So, Chapter 47, Jo's Will. In this chapter, Mr. Alan Woodcourt is looking for somewhere to house Jo, who is the boy that we have met several times before, who is currently very unwell, and Mr. Woodcourt wants to try and find a way to help him. So he takes Jo round to Miss Flight to ask if she knows of anywhere that they can find him lodging to get him well. Miss Flight has moved, of course, because of all of the drama that happened at Crook Shop, and is now living where Mr. Gridley used to live. And thinking of Mr. Gridley makes her think of Mr. George, and she suggests that Mr. Woodcourt go and ask Mr. George, because Mr. George is always very helpful to everyone and tries to take care of people. So Mr. Woodcourt goes to Mr. George, who says he is perfectly willing to take Jo in, and for Jo to have a little space in the shooting gallery and a mattress so that he can kind of try and get well. However, Jo does not seem to be getting very well. He is visited by Mr. Jarndyce and by Esther and by Mr. Woodcourt again and again. Mr. Woodcourt and Mr. George learn through Jo that a lot of his trouble and his kind of being constantly moving on is caused by Inspector Bucket and Mr. Tulkinghorn, and we see again Mr. George's anger at Mr. Tulkinghorn for various reasons. Jo is also visited by Mr. Snagsby, and Jo asks Mr. Snagsby to write for him somewhere that he didn't mean to make Esther ill, that he wishes he hadn't, and that he is very sorry for having made her ill. And at the end of this chapter, in the final few sentences of this chapter, Jo dies with Mr. Woodcourt by him trying to comfort him. So, points of interest in this chapter. One thing I want to talk about, which I think is quite interesting in this chapter, is like the weird presence of Esther in a chapter that she doesn't appear. She is quite important in this chapter in many ways. The reason why Miss Flight directs Mr. Woodcourt to Mr. George is because she knows that Mr. George knows Esther, and that therefore, because this boy is connected to Esther in some way, that will mean that Mr. George is more likely to help. Mr. George says to Mr. Woodcourt, "It seems to me probable you might take more than a common interest in this poor creature, because Miss Summerson has taken that unfortunate interest in him. 'Tis my case, I assure you." "And mine, Mr. George." The trooper looks sideways at Alan's sunburnt cheek and bright dark eye, rapidly measures his height and build, and seems to approve of him. And this moment I find quite interesting, because both of these men are helping this little boy because they like Esther, and because Esther looked after this little boy, and because she was compassionate towards Jo, they are too. They kind of learn compassion from her. And Mr. George and Mr. Woodcourt are both pretty compassionate men throughout the book, but I do find it quite interesting in terms of this idea throughout the book of Esther being this sort of good angel who makes the people around her good. Another thing I find quite interesting is the way Mr. George looks at Mr. Woodcourt, kind of like looks him up and down. And what I think is happening here, like what I imagine is going through Mr. George's head, is that he looks at Mr. Woodcourt, thinks Mr. Woodcourt has some kind of like romantic interest in Esther, and he like looks him up and down to make sure that he thinks that he is good enough for Esther. And I really like this because in many ways, Mr. George, we know, was the best friend of Captain Horden, who we know is Esther's father. Mr. George doesn't know this, but in a way, he kind of takes on the role of Esther's father's friend, in kind of like looking out for her welfare and caring about her as she does. He kind of takes on this role of being her father's friend, almost like her godfather, which he does almost have a right to, and in a different world would have been, which I just think is quite nice. And we see as well, in terms of Esther's presence and absence in this chapter, that what worries Jo most on his deathbed is that he made Esther ill. He worries that he made this woman ill who was kind to him, and that is what kind of plays on his conscience when he's dying, especially because Esther is tied up in his head with Lady Dedlock, who asked him to like show her Nemo/Captain Horden died. Like there's so much going on here in connection with Esther, and it's Esther which connects Mr. George and Mr. Woodcourt and Jo. Another thing I want to talk about in this chapter is the social criticism in it, and the way Dickens uses Jo as a kind of symbol of social critique. Although I find it really interesting that Jo is both like a symbol in this book, but also a fully fledged character in his own right, and he has his personality and he has his likes and dislikes and his interests, and is fully formed and well-rounded and really interesting, but also Dickens does use him as this kind of symbol of everyone who is poor and forgotten in London. Mr. Woodcourt says to Mr. George, "I am unwilling to place him in a hospital, even if I could procure him immediate admission, because I foresee that he would not stay there many hours if he could be so much as got there. The same objection applies to the workhouse, supposing I had the patience to be evaded and shirked and handed about from post to pillar in trying to get him into one, which is a system that I don't take kindly to." And here Dickens is really sort of highlighting the insufficiency of the institutions that are there to look after the poor. And later when Phil Squad and Mr. George take Joe in, Dickens writes that Joe is not one of Mrs. Pardigle's Tockahooba Indians. He is not one of Mrs. Jellyby's lambs, being wholly unconnected with Burio Bulagar. He is not softened by distance and unfamiliarity. He is not a genuine foreign-grown savage. He is the ordinary homemade article, dirty, ugly, disagreeable to all the senses, in body a common creature of common streets, only in soul a heathen. Homely filth begrimes him, homely parasites devour him, homely sores are in him, homely rags are on him. Native ignorance, the growth of English soil and climate, sinks his immoral nature lower than the beasts that perish. Stand forth, Joe, in uncompromising colours. From the sole of thy foot to the crown of thy head, there is nothing interesting about thee. And I think this paragraph is really important and sums up a lot of Dickens's criticism of charity in this book. We've noticed, and I've talked about before in these discussion videos, how he's very critical of charities which support people abroad, who the people doing the charity don't understand, and kind of he's very critical of foreign missions and people like Mrs. Jellyby and Mrs. Pardigle, supporting through their charities people who they don't know about, causes who they know nothing about, who they don't understand, and neglecting the people around them and being cruel to the people around them, and how these particular kinds of charities view the people they're helping as homogeneous masses that aren't individual people. Whereas Dickens really praises the charity of Esther and Mr. Jarndyce and Mr. Woodcourt, people like that, where their charity is much more like personal and they look after individual people. And basically what Dickens is doing here is he's criticising the Victorian romanticisation of people who are poor in other countries, at the expense and neglect of people who are poor in this country. I've spoken before about this kind of Victorian idea that Dickens is very fond of like charity should start at home, and why are these people trying to fix other countries when we haven't fixed England, which, you know, is a kind of problematic idea of Dickens, but I do think it's one that's very interesting, and it's one that he's definitely focusing on here, the idea that nobody in England cares about people like Joe, because Joe is boring, and ordinary, and English poverty just entirely neglected, whereas people like Mrs. Jellyby and other particular kind of society women are interested in poor people in different countries because they have kind of romanticised them in their head, and think that they can kind of fix them, whereas they really don't care about poor people in this country. And again, I feel like his criticism of charity is kind of bound up with a sort of criticism of colonialism. Another thing I want to talk about here is the scene of Joe's death, because I think the scene of Joe's death is a huge kind of moment of social criticism in many ways, and the way Dickens kind of paints him is a sort of like a martyr to poverty. When Joe talks about wanting to be buried beside Mr. Nemo, this is what he says: "It's time for me to go to that there burying ground, sir, where they laid him as was very good to me indeed he was. It's time for me to go down to that burying ground, sir, and ask to be put along with him. I want to go there and be buried. He used to say to me, 'I am as poor as you today, Joe,' he says. I want to tell him that I am as poor as him now and have come there to be laid alongside him." Man, Dickens can write a good death scene. The moment where Joe dies, Dickens kind of goes into this particular narrative voice, which he often uses when he is addressing not just the reader, but like a Victorian establishment. He says, "Dead, your majesty, dead, my lords and gentlemen, dead, right reverends and wrong reverends of every order, dead men and women, born with heavenly compassion in your hearts, and dying thus around us every day." And there he makes, you know, Joe not merely the individual person that he is, but into a symbol of everyone who's poor in Victorian Britain, who is dying, neglected and forgotten about by every kind of sphere of society. You notice how in this paragraph he says, like, "Your majesty, my lords and gentlemen, right reverends and wrong reverends, men and women." He kind of goes down from the high to the like everyday men and women, you know, like everyone should be looking around them for these people who are dying and we're doing nothing. Like, it's so powerful, it's so good. Dickens is social critiquing best. Another thing I want to talk about a bit in this chapter is just sort of the presentation of Mr. Bucket and Mr. Tulkinghorn, who are again kind of present and absent in this chapter. Obviously we know that Joe has been kind of moved from place to place, unable to settle down and recover himself from his illness because he's being shifted along by Inspector Bucket and Mr. Tulkinghorn, who don't want him anywhere to be seen. We know that Joe is terrified of Mr. Bucket, and Mr. Bucket is such an interesting character. I'll talk about this a bit more for the third chapter we read in May, but Mr. Bucket is a really interesting character because it's very hard to tell whether he is a villain or a likeable character, because sometimes I really like Mr. Bucket, but also like he does kind of drive Joe to his death. But also he only does it because Mr. Tulkinghorn has made him, and also I don't think he means to do it. And it's interesting to note too that Mr. George's anger about what has happened to Joe and his kind of fury at what the world has done to Joe is all directed at Mr. Tulkinghorn and none at Mr. Bucket. When Mr. Woodcourt asks Mr. George what kind of man Tulkinghorn is, he says he is a confoundedly bad kind of man. He is a slow torturing kind of man. He is no more like flesh and blood than a rusty old carline is. He is the kind of man, by George, that has caused me more restlessness and more uneasiness and more dissatisfaction with myself than all other men put together. That's the kind of man Mr. Tulkinghorn is. And talking of Mr. Tulkinghorn, let's move on to chapter 48, Closing In. Here we are back in Lady Dedlock's London house. Mr. Tulkinghorn is still kind of hanging around, as he does, and Lady Dedlock has decided that she has had enough of waiting to find out what will happen, and if she can do nothing else, she wants to remove Rosa, her maid and friend who has been with her. She wants to remove Rosa from her orbit and influence and place Rosa with the man that she may one day marry, so that Rosa is free from any scandal and taint of scandal that may come to Lady Dedlock soon. So she calls for Mr. Rouncewell, who is the father of the young man that Rosa is in love with and who is in love with Rosa, and she tells Mr. Rouncewell to take Rosa away and place her somewhere until she can marry Wat Rouncewell, and that she no longer wants Rosa to be with her. Mr. Rouncewell does indeed take Rosa away, though Rosa is very sad to go, and Mr. Tulkinghorn happens to be in the room when all this happens, because Mr. Tulkinghorn is always there lurking in a corner. And after this, Mr. Tulkinghorn confronts Lady Dedlock, says how dare she do anything to change the status quo without saying so to him first, that he now considers their agreement to be at an end, and that he is now willing and about to tell Sir Leicester Dedlock all of Lady Dedlock's past whenever he so chooses, but of course he won't tell her when, but it may be as soon as tomorrow, which of course caused Lady Dedlock quite a lot of strain and stress, and she goes out on a walk to recover herself. And then at the very end of this chapter, there is a commotion near where Mr. Tulkinghorn lives, and Mr. Tulkinghorn has been found in his chambers, shot dead. Bet you didn't see that coming. So, many things to talk about in this chapter. Let's talk a little bit about the relationship between Rosa and Lady Dedlock, which I always find very interesting. Again, I think that it's fair to say that the relationship Lady Dedlock has with Rosa is in many ways her viewing Rosa as a kind of surrogate child. She can never know her true daughter, Esther, but Rosa is a similar age to Esther, maybe a year or two younger, and she kind of has taken Rosa under her wing and wants the best for her. She cares for this person in a way she does not care really for anybody else. I think in many ways it's because for Lady Dedlock, Rosa has taken on the role of her daughter. I told you, Rosa, that I wished you to be happy, and that I would make you so if I could make anybody happy on this earth. I cannot. There are reasons now known to me, reasons in which you have no part, rendering it far better for you that you should not remain here. You must not remain here. I am determined that you shall not. I have said, my child, that what I do for your sake, not my own. It is done. What I am towards you, Rosa, is what I am now, not what I shall be a little while hence. Remember this and keep my confidence. And Lady Dedlock, I think, must know that in sending Rosa away, she is doing something which may make Mr. Tulkinghorn turn against her. She is doing something that he's asked her not to do and drawing attention to herself because she's behaving slightly oddly because of her secret, but at the same time she does it because she wishes to spare Rosa, and because at this moment in time she cares more for Rosa than she does for herself. And it's interesting too to note that the way she talks about Rosa to Rosa is very different to the way she talks about Rosa to Mr. Rouncewell, where she is very dismissive of her. The girl is a very good girl. I have nothing whatsoever to say against her, but she is so far insensible to the many advantages and her good fortune that she is in love, or supposes she is, poor little fool, and unable to appreciate them. And of course we need to talk about the relationship here between Mr. Tulkinghorn and Lady Dedlock, because it is very interesting. Very interesting too that Lady Dedlock decides to go ahead with all this, despite the fact that Mr. Tulkinghorn is there, because she is just that kind of strong. When Lady Dedlock goes in to see Mr. Sir Leicester Dedlock to say that Mr. Rouncewell is here, she finds Mr. Tulkinghorn there, always at hand, haunting every place, no relief or security from him for a moment. And later, there is not much that Lady Dedlock, seated in her chair, could wish to see through the window at which Mr. Tulkinghorn stands, and yet she sends a look in that direction as if it were her heart's desire to have that figure removed out of the way. And later, when Mr. Tulkinghorn and Lady Dedlock talk, we see things from his perspective too. Then the lights are brought in, discovering Mr. Tulkinghorn still standing in his window with his hands behind him, and my lady still sitting with this figure before her, closing up her view of the night as well as of the day. She is very pale. Mr. Tulkinghorn, observing it as she rises to retire, thinks, well, she may be. The power of this woman is astonishing. She has been acting a part the whole time. but he can act a part too. And then the conversation they have where he confronts her. I love this conversation. There's so much tension in it. What do you want, sir? Why, Lady Dedlock? I am rather surprised by the course you have taken. Indeed. Yes, decidedly. I was not prepared for it. I consider it a departure from our agreement and your promise. It puts us in a new position, Lady Dedlock. I feel myself under the necessity of saying that I don't approve of it. I consider that a dangerous proceeding. I know it to be unnecessary and calculated to awake speculation, doubt, rumour, I don't know what, in the house. Besides, it is a violation of our agreement. You are to be exactly as you were before, whereas it must be evident to yourself as it is to me that you have this evening been very different from what you were before. If, sir, she begins, in my knowledge of my secret. Now, Lady Dedlock, this is a matter of business, and in a matter of business the ground cannot be kept too clear. It is no longer your secret. Excuse me, that is just the mistake. It is my secret, in trust for Sir Leicester and the family. If it were your secret, Lady Dedlock, we would not be here holding this conversation. That is very true. If, in my knowledge of the secret, I do what I can to spare an innocent girl from the taint of my impending shame, I act upon a resolution I have taken. Nothing in the world, and no one in the world could shake it or could move me. Really? Then you see, Lady Dedlock, he returns, you are not to be trusted. Such tension. And later, do you contemplate undeceiving Sir Leicester Dedlock tonight? A home question, says Mr. Tulkinghorn with a slight smile and cautiously shaking his head at the shaded face. No, not tonight. Tomorrow. All things considered, I had better decline answering that question, Lady Dedlock. And then Mr. Tulkinghorn heads home, and we get all of the foreshadowing at once, with Dickens saying that really everything around him should be telling him not to go home, but of course it doesn't, and even if it did he wouldn't listen because he is a sensible, practical man who goes home to his chambers. And while Mr. Tulkinghorn heads home to his chambers, Lady Dedlock goes out for a walk to ease her headache. She says she may be an hour, but no more, but she doesn't want anyone to go with her. And then we go back to Mr. Tulkinghorn's areas near Chancery, and what's that? Who fired a gun or pistol? Where was it? The few foot passengers stop and stare about them. Some windows and doors are opened and people come out to look. It was a loud report and echoed and rattled heavily. And then in the morning, Mr. Tulkinghorn doesn't appear, and when someone goes in to clean his rooms, they find him lying face downwards on the floor, shot through the heart. Well now, that's a dramatic end to the chapter, isn't it? Now, the first time I experienced Bleak House was through a television adaptation, not through the book. But I remember watching that TV adaptation, and the moment Mr. Tulkinghorn is killed, being like, oh my goodness, I did not expect that to happen. Like, what a turn up, what a dramatic moment. And I don't know if I would have expected it slightly more in the book. I don't think I would have done, but it's hard to say because I've always read the book knowing some of the story. But the fact that Mr. Tulkinghorn is just like murdered at this point, and now we like start on a murder investigation in true like Dickensian brilliance. It's just wonderful. It's just so dramatic. Which brings us on to chapter 49, Dutiful Friendship. In this chapter, it is Mrs. Bagnet's birthday, and we follow the Bagnets as they celebrate her birthday, including Mr. Bagnet, who's not very good at cooking and trying to cook her dinner, and then Mr. George comes along to celebrate her birthday with them all. George is in fairly low spirits because Joe died the day before, and he is very cut up about it and feels bad that he could not do more, but he manages to rally himself for the birthday celebrations, especially when his friend Mr. Bucket turns up, who he doesn't seem to be annoyed with whatsoever about Joe, which again I think stems back to George's understanding of Mr. Bucket as a person, understanding that Mr. Bucket puts duty and his job above all else and does what he is employed to do, and that for him the reason why Joe is dead is all Mr. Tulkinghorn's fault and nothing to do with Mr. Bucket. Mr. Bucket was just following orders, which I think is the best way to look at Mr. Bucket, and in the way, and it's kind of the way he looks at himself as well. But Mr. Bucket turns up and everything seems fine. He gets on well with the little children because he really likes children and hasn't been able to have any of his own with his wife, and he gets on well with the Bagnets as well and kind of makes friends with all of them greatly. And then him and George leave together, and as they leave, Mr. Bucket takes Mr. George by the arm and then pulls him into a public house and arrests him for the murder of Mr. Tulkinghorn, because, you know, drama. So, points of interest in this chapter. I don't think I need to dwell too long on Mr. and Mrs. Bagnet. I've spoken about them before and how I quite enjoy their marriage. They are one of the few happily married couples in Dickens, but they get on very well, and they get on very well with George, and they are a nice pair to spend a chapter with. I want to talk a little bit about George's reaction to Joe's death because I do think it's important. When Mrs. Bagnet says he looks a little pale, he says, I didn't know I looked white and I didn't know I looked shocked, and I'm sorry I do, but the truth is that a boy who was taken in at my place died yesterday afternoon and it has rather knocked me up. Here was this poor lad, 'twas dull work to see him dying as he did and not be able to help him. I mean, Mrs. Bagnet, there he was, dying without ever having been taught much more than to know his right hand from his left, and he was too far gone to be helped out at that. Then that brought up Gridley in a man's mind. He was a bad case too, in a different way. Then the two got mixed up in a man's mind with that flinty old rascal who had to do with them both, by which he means Mr. Tulkinghorn. And to think of that rusty carbine, stock and barrel, standing up on end in his corner, hard, indifferent, taking everything so evenly, it made my flesh and blood tingle, I do assure you. And this again, we see the kind of social critique of these people driven to death by law and by people like Mr. Tulkinghorn. Although, interestingly, of course, that we know he's talking about Mr. Tulkinghorn because he uses the word carbine, which he used to describe Mr. Tulkinghorn before. But if not, he could be talking about Mr. Bucket, because Mr. Bucket was involved in chasing down both Joe and Mr. Gridley too. Which again, just Mr. Bucket is such a complicated and interesting character. And talking of Mr. Bucket, let's talk about Mr. Bucket. He turns up and he is incredibly agreeable. Like, he is just really nice to everybody, especially the way he talks to the children. It's just like really nice with them and really, really good with the children. Mrs. Bagnet asks if he has a family of his own. He says, "Would you believe it? No, I haven't. My wife and a lodger constitute my family. Mrs. Bucket is as fond of children as myself and as wishful to have them, but no, so it is. Worldly goods are divided unequally and a man must not repine." Which I just think is like a real nice moment of humanity from Mr. Bucket, where you learn much more about him almost than you learn the rest of the time. You learn that he is married and really wants kids and is really good with kids but doesn't have any, which gives you a kind of insight into his life and a real kind of stronger sense of his humanity. He gets on well with everybody and everybody seems to like him. Dickens writes, "This sparkling stranger is such a new and agreeable feature in the evening that Mr. George, who testified no great emotions of pleasure on his entrance, begins in spite of himself to be rather proud of him. He is so friendly, is a man of so many resources and so easy to get on with that it is something to have him made known here." It's interesting, again, because Mr. Bucket, like, I quite like Mr. Bucket, and he comes across well in this chapter as a friendly, agreeable man who is trying to make what he knows may be Joe's last night out of custody for a while pleasant and agreeable, and trying to kind of get on with George's friends to make it nice for them, and so that they don't suspect anything. But at the same time, he's also a man that we know can play a part, and whether or not he is playing a part here in order to ease George into a false sense of security, we just don't know. Like, how do you know? Such an interesting character. And then as Mr. Bucket and George leave together, Mr. Bucket takes hold of his arm and, "Wait half a minute, George, I should wish to speak to you first." Immediately afterwards, he twists him into a public house and into a parlour where he confronts him and claps his own back against the door. "Now, George," says Mr. Bucket, "duty is duty and friendship is friendship. I never want the two to clash if I can help it. I have endeavoured to make things pleasant tonight, and I put it to you whether I have done it or not. You must consider yourself in custody, George." "Custody? For what?" returns the trooper, thunderstruck. "Now, George," says Mr. Bucket, urging a sensible view of the case upon him with his fat forefinger, "duty, as you know very well, is one thing and conversation is another. It's my duty to inform you that any observations you make will be liable to be used against you. Therefore, George, be careful what you say. You don't happen to have heard of a murder." "Murder?" "Now, George," says Mr. Bucket, "bear in mind what I've said to you. I ask you nothing. You've been in low spirits this afternoon. I say, you don't happen to have heard of a murder." "No. Where has there been a murder?" "Now, George," says Mr. Bucket, "don't you go and commit yourself. I'm going to tell you what I want you for. There has been a murder in Lincoln Inn Fields. Gentleman of the name of Tulkinghorn. He was shot last night. I want you for that." And George is evidently surprised by his arrest. He sinks upon the seat behind him and says to Mr. Bucket, "It's not possible that Mr. Tulkinghorn has been killed and you suspect me." And then when Mr. Bucket says that the deed was done last night, George has to admit that he went there last night. Mr. Bucket points out that he's been hanging about the place, that people have heard him threaten Mr. Tulkinghorn, and that is why he has to arrest him. He puts handcuffs on him, but makes an effort to make George as comfortable as possible, and it's clear that he takes no pleasure whatsoever in arresting George. And we do get the impression from Mr. Bucket, though again, how do you ever know from an impression of Mr. Bucket if it's right? We do get the impression of him that he likes Mr. George, and the chapter ends with him arresting him. So there we have it, 3 very interesting chapters with lots occurring in the month of May. So in the month of June, which is already well underway, we will be reading / are reading currently the following chapters. Chapter 50, Esther's narrative, Chapter 51, Enlightened, Chapter 52, Obstinacy, and Chapter 53, The Track. Lots happening in June as well. So that is all for today and all I have to say about May's chapters of Bleak House. Please let me know down in the comments if you enjoyed this month's chapters, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.